My friends, let me tell you something tender, but true. There comes a time when kindness must be wise, not weak. Some people will take your light and try to live in its glow while dimming your own. Now, I do believe in grace. I do believe in love. But I also believe in standing tall when someone mistakes your goodness for a gift they didn't earn. Today, I want to speak to the hearts that have been too nice, too long, to those who mistake cruelty for charm. This is for the soul that knows it's time to rise. Let me give you 5 truths, 5 bold moves, and I want you to walk with me now, not just hear them, but feel them, live them. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin the delicate divine process of reclaiming your dignity from the hands of someone who never intended to honor it. You begin to understand that your worth was never meant to be proved in conversations that go in circles, never meant to be defended like a thesis before a jury of one who's already decided to misunderstand you. You realize that the more you explain, the more you give away pieces of your peace to someone who sees your openness as an opportunity to manipulate. You find yourself drained over and over because every sentence you speak in defense of your heart is thrown back at you as ammunition. You start to notice the way your voice shakes, not from fear, but from exhaustion, because explaining yourself is not about clarity anymore. It becomes about survival, about trying to hold together a bond that was never held together by truth in the first place. And so you stop, not out of coldness, not out of pride, but out of a quiet kind of wisdom that says enough. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head before they happen. You stop rewriting your truth in softer tones just to be digestible to someone who never tasted your sincerity with gratitude. You stop bending over backwards to justify why you were hurt, why you need space, why you feel unsettled. You stop trying to prove that your experience matters. You stop standing at the edge of your own sanity, hoping that one more explanation might finally unlock compassion. You begin to understand that no amount of clarity will ever satisfy someone who is committed to confusion. You begin to see that your energy is currency, and the more you spend it trying to be understood by someone who listens only to argue, the more bankrupt you become in your own soul. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin to breathe easier. You begin to live less in your head and more in your spirit. You begin to honor the quiet truth that not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability. You realize that some people don't ask for explanations to understand you. They ask so they can twist, deny, dismiss, and invalidate. And when you stop feeding that cycle, it dies. Slowly at first, but surely, you start to notice the silence that follows is not empty, but full. Full of your own reclaimed power. Full of a calm that doesn't need to shout to be strong. You start to feel the ground beneath your feet again, solid and yours. You start to hear your own inner voice getting louder now that it isn't drowned out by the noise of someone else's doubt. You notice that you feel lighter, not because you've won an argument, but because you've left the arena. You remember that your truth doesn't need defense. It needs space. It needs presence. It needs protection. You begin to understand that choosing not to explain is not the same as being closed off. It is, in fact, one of the deepest forms of self-respect. It is a statement, a declaration, a line drawn not in anger, but in grace. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop standing trial in a courtroom where the verdict has already been written in ink. You choose instead to walk out of that courtroom, not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. You choose to invest your breath into things that bring you peace, not into battles that only steal it. You recognize that clarity is a gift, and you will no longer place that gift in the hands of those who treat it like a weapon. You begin to live as if your truth is valid simply because you lived it, felt it, survived it, survived it. You begin to walk like someone who knows that being understood by everyone is not nearly as important as being true to yourself. When you set a boundary and do not move it, you are planting your flag in the soil of your own self-worth and saying without hesitation that you will no longer abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. You are not punishing anyone by setting limits. You are protecting the fragile, sacred parts of you that have too long been exposed to criticism, manipulation, and the subtle erosion of your identity. You understand now that a boundary is not a wall to shut love out. It is a gatekeeper for your peace, your safety, and your soul. When you set that boundary, you do it not with loudness but with clarity, not with vengeance but with certainty. And when someone pushes against it, as they will, you stand firm. You do not flinch. You do not explain it away. You do not shift it to avoid conflict. Because you've learned that every time you bend a boundary for someone who refuses to respect it, you are teaching them that your needs are optional. You are teaching them that your healing is not a priority. But when you hold that line, even when your knees shake, you send a different message. You say, I have value. You say, I am not a doormat for your moods. You say, I love myself enough to walk away from patterns that hurt. You stop feeling guilty for drawing the line because you realize that people who truly love you will honor your boundaries without needing to understand every inch of them. You begin to see that those who resist your limits are the very ones who benefited most from your lack of them. And you do not let that stop you. You do not let their anger, their silence, or their blame cloud your clarity. Because you now know that a person who loves control will always be upset when you take yours back. You begin to see how setting a boundary changes everything. It shifts the energy. It reveals the truth. It exposes intentions. It filters the real from the pretending. A boundary is not just about saying no. It is about saying yes to yourself. Yes to rest. Yes to respect. Yes to reclaiming time that used to be stolen by conflict, chaos, and constant emotional labor. When you refuse to move your boundary, you are no longer negotiating your value in spaces where you were once reduced, ignored, or diminished. You stop being available for conversations that drain you. You stop attending the emotional circus of someone else's unhealed wounds. You stop sacrificing your peace to maintain connections that depend on your silence, your submission, or your suffering. You hold the line with grace, but also with firmness. And when someone tries to guilt you with phrases like, you've changed, or you used to be more understanding, you don't flinch. Because yes, you have changed. You have evolved. You have grown weary of betraying yourself. You have grown tired of playing small. You have decided that kindness is not the same as self-abandonment. You now know that compassion for others cannot come at the cost of cruelty toward yourself. So you stay firm. You do not explain away the boundary. You do not apologize for the shift. You do not soften it to appease their discomfort. Because your healing is not up for discussion. Your needs are not a negotiation. Your emotional safety is not something to be bartered. You are not responsible for how others feel about the boundaries you set to protect yourself. You are only responsible for honoring what you need to stay whole. And with every day that passes, you become more fluent in this language of self-respect. You begin to speak it, not only with words, but with your silence, your absence, and your refusal to entertain what no longer aligns with your peace. When you let silence be your loudest answer, you begin to understand the unmatched power of restraint and the grace found in holding your peace when chaos begs you to respond. Silence becomes your protection, your protest, your statement. It is not passivity. It is not weakness. It is deliberate and disciplined. It is the sacred refusal to engage with noise that has no intention of truth. You stop wasting words on someone who only listens to distort. You stop repeating yourself in hopes of being heard by someone who never intended to listen. You begin to notice how silence disarms those who thrive on reaction, who feed off emotional responses, who wait for you to defend yourself so they can twist your words into something small, something wrong, something shameful. When you offer silence instead, they are left with only their own noise, and in that stillness, your strength rises. You understand that not every battle deserves your breath. Not every accusation needs a counterpoint. Not every insult warrants a response. You no longer feel the urge to fix the narrative, to explain the intentions behind your heart, to clarify your boundaries to someone who only asks so they can cross them. Your silence becomes the line. It becomes the mirror. It becomes the truth that echoes louder than any defense. Because silence tells the story of everything you endured. It speaks volumes about your wisdom, your restraint, and your healing. You no longer beg to be understood. You no longer offer up your truth like a sacrifice, hoping it will be accepted. You let your absence speak when your presence is taken for granted. You let your stillness scream when your voice has been ignored one too many times. You know now that responding is a gift, not an obligation. You decide who gets the privilege of your words. You become fluent in quiet strength, no longer trying to convince someone that your pain is real or that your boundaries are valid. You simply step back, you step out, you step away, and in doing so, you take back everything that was stolen in the chaos of constant confrontation. You begin to recognize that your silence is not empty. It is full of your decision to honor your peace. It is full of every word you chose not to say because you now understand that healing does not always require closure from the one who caused the wound. Sometimes it requires distance. Sometimes it requires you to walk away without ever turning around to explain why. And so you sit in the stillness. You let them wonder. You let them feel the space your voice once filled. You let them hear the echo of your absence. And in that silence, you heal. You grow. You rise. You stop participating in cycles that only lead you back to confusion. You stop watering dead gardens with your attention. You stop throwing your pearls into pits where they are trampled and forgotten. Your silence becomes sacred. It becomes a boundary. It becomes a language only the wise can understand. You do not need to shout to be strong. You do not need to argue to be right. You do not need to explain yourself to be at peace. You sit with yourself in the silence and realize you are not alone. You are aligned. You are centered. You are powerful, and you no longer give energy to what drains you. You no longer respond out of habit. You respond only when it serves your healing. You allow the silence to clear the air, to show the truth, to reveal what words could never fully express. And in that quiet, you remember who you are. When you walk away without the need to be understood, you free yourself from the invisible chains of needing approval from someone who never tried to see you clearly in the first place. You release the exhausting habit of chasing closure, where there is only chaos and waiting for apologies from those who are more committed to defending their behavior than understanding your experience. You stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces where your truth has to be softened, your tone has to be adjusted, and your pain has to be minimized for the comfort of another. You learn to walk even with your heart still breaking, even with questions still lingering, even when every part of you aches to explain your side one more time. You walk anyway, because you've come to know that not everyone deserves to witness your full truth, especially those who made a habit of misinterpreting it. You begin to see that trying to be understood by someone who never had the intention of hearing you only deepens the wound. It pulls you back into the trap of over-explaining, of justifying your boundaries, of watering yourself down so they won't feel threatened by your growth. When you walk away without the need to be understood, you're saying with your steps that your healing is not dependent on their comprehension. You don't need them to agree with your decision. You don't need them to accept your version of the story. You don't need them to validate what you lived through. Because now you know that your experience is valid, whether or not they acknowledge it. Your pain is real, whether or not they apologize. Your truth stands strong, even if they continue to deny it. You let go of the illusion that clarity must come from outside yourself. You learn to carry the kind of peace that doesn't demand confirmation. And even though it stings to leave without the comfort of being understood, you begin to realize that peace is not found in someone else's acceptance of your truth. It is found in your refusal to argue about it anymore. You stop sending long messages trying to explain your heart. You stop hoping that if you just say it differently, they'll finally see what they did. You stop asking questions that only reopen wounds. You stop waiting for them to wake up to your worth. You walk away knowing that the truth does not become less true just because someone refuses to see it. You begin to trust that time will show what words never could. You stop looking back, hoping to be chased, and start looking forward to places where your voice will be honored, your boundaries will be respected, and your spirit can rest. You walk away and carry with you everything they refuse to see: the beauty, the loyalty, the grace, the forgiveness, the patience, the depth. You carry it not as a burden, but as a blessing, knowing that someone else will see it, and more importantly, knowing that you finally see it yourself. You no longer confuse being misunderstood with being wrong. You no longer sacrifice your truth to maintain false peace. You no longer beg for the bare minimum of empathy. You choose yourself, not because it's easy, not because you're heartless, but because you've tried every other way to be seen and heard and still ended up empty. So now you fill yourself. You remind yourself that walking away does not mean you lost. It means you stopped gambling with your spirit. You walk away without fanfare, without final words, without needing them to nod in agreement. You let them sit with their version while you move forward with yours. You no longer hold space for people who couldn't hold space for your truth. You leave with quiet power, with dignity in your silence, and strength in every step that takes you closer to peace. When you reclaim your time, your energy, your peace, you begin the sacred act of returning to yourself in a world that has pulled you in every direction but home. You take back the hours that were spent explaining, fixing, soothing, and sacrificing for someone who never offered the same in return. You start to see that your life is not a waiting room for someone else to grow, change, or become the person they promised they would be. You understand now that the years spent hoping, trying, and enduring were not wasted, but they taught you the cost of self-neglect. You begin to gather the pieces of yourself that you gave away too freely, not because you were foolish, but because you were kind, and your kindness was mistaken for something to be controlled. You reclaim your time by saying no to conversations that lead nowhere, no to emotional labor that leaves you depleted, no to the games that leave you confused. You stop rushing to respond, to rescue, to repair, and instead you rest. You breathe. You pause. You put your needs back on the list after being at the bottom for far too long. You stop chasing peace from people who only know how to create storms. You stop letting your day be disrupted by someone else's chaos. You stop making room for drama in your calendar. You reclaim your energy by no longer investing in arguments that only go in circles, in relationships that require you to abandon your truth, in patterns that leave you exhausted and questioning your worth. You stop apologizing for needing quiet. You stop explaining why you're distant. You stop justifying your absence. You begin to realize that protecting your energy is not rude, it is necessary. You protect it like you protect your breath, because without it, you cannot be fully alive. You turn your attention to the things that pour into you instead of drain you. You start to notice how much lighter you feel when you're no longer managing someone else's emotions. You begin to enjoy the silence they once filled with confusion. You find joy in the spaces they used to cloud with tension. You reclaim your peace by refusing to be baited into conflict. You stop proving your loyalty to someone who never proved they were safe. You no longer let guilt write the script of your days. You choose solitude over superficial connection. You choose boundaries over access. You choose your own stillness over someone else's noise. And it feels unfamiliar at first because you were so used to giving, so used to fixing, so used to being available. But now you see that peace doesn't come through performance. It comes through presence, through being present with yourself in ways you never had time for, through reclaiming your mornings, your mind, your space, through building a life that isn't dictated by someone else's emotional state. You begin to value your peace like a priceless heirloom passed down from the woman you are to the woman you are becoming. You hold it with reverence. You guard it with conviction. You stop handing it over to anyone who knocks at the door of your heart with empty intentions. You learn to live in a slower rhythm, no longer running to meet someone else's pace, no longer sprinting toward acceptance, no longer dancing for approval. You move with grace, with discernment, with a softness that is no longer afraid of being called selfish. Because you know now that self-preservation is not cruelty. It is wisdom. You fill your days with what feeds you. You speak less and listen more to your body, to your spirit, to the quiet wisdom that was buried under all the noise. You remember who you were before the depletion, before the drama, before the confusion. You remember that you were never made to be consumed. You were meant to be cherished. And in reclaiming your time, your energy, your peace, you finally start living like it.